and I briefed all of the leadership of the plans to get them back into chambers. That would have been call number 3 with Speaker Pelosi.
So you didn't have one call, you didn't have two calls, you had 3 calls. So Speaker Pelosi's comments that she didn't speak to you are inaccurate.
That is correct, sir.
Today we're here to discuss the security failures that occurred on January 6, 2021, and how we can prevent these failures from occurring again. I want to dive into the questions, Chief Son. In your transcribed interview, you mentioned that you met with the House Sergeant at Arms regarding the National Guard prior to January 6th. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And who was the House Sergeant at Arms leading up to and on January 6th?
That would be Paul Irving.
And the House Sergeant at Arms is appointed by who?
It was appointed at that time by Speaker Pelosi.
And in your transcribed interview, you mentioned that when you first brought up the National Guard to the House Sergeant at Arms in the days leading up to January 6, that Mr. Irving said he, quote, didn't like the optics, end quote. Is that correct?
That is correct. He referenced being concerned for optics.
And on January 6, when you went to Mr. Irving to get his approval to call in the Guard, Mr. Irving said he would, quote, run it up the chain. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was a telephone call. I didn't see him in person when I first made that request.
The House Sergeant at Arms is considered probably the most senior security official on the House side. When Mr. Irving says he has to, quote, run it up the chain, end quote, what did that mean?
I took that to mean his leadership chain.
And who would be his leadership chain? If he's functionally the most senior security official on the House side, correct?
That's his title. That's part of the title, the senior law enforcement official for the House of Representatives. But he would have been referring to the leadership team that goes up to Speaker Pelosi.
So the political leadership team, meaning elected officials, not another security official. Is that your understanding?
That is correct, sir. He's the top security official for the House.
So running up the chain would most likely, in your opinion, is through the Speaker's office and possibly to Speaker Pelosi? That
would be where it ends, yes.
Okay, so let's park that there, and then let's jump to a second set here. In a press conference on January 7th, Speaker Pelosi called for your resignation on national television. Speaker Pelosi also stated that she had not talked to you since the initial breach of the Capitol. But according to your transcribed interview, you were on the phone with Speaker Pelosi a few times. Can you explain that discrepancy?
Yeah, that is correct. I spoke to Speaker Pelosi 3 times that evening, and she went on national TV and said I'd never spoken to her, but I spoke to her 3 times. The three times were the first time when I went over to brief Vice President Pence at the secure location. I had called House Sergeant at Arms Irving, told him I was going over to brief the Vice President. I was also going over to do a personal assessment of the Capitol. At that point, things were getting under control. Went over there, briefed him on when we can get them back into chambers with Mr. Irving being fully aware. He said he wanted to get Speaker Pelosi on the phone. He made a phone call from his cell phone at approximately 5:34, where I first briefed Speaker Pelosi. The second call was when I left that location. As I was walking away, I met up with Mr. Stenger, and we started walking over to the Senate to go brief the Senate. When Jennifer Hemingway, I believe it was Jennifer Hemingway, handed me the cell phone, and it was Emily Barrett's cell phone calling her, and it was Speaker Pelosi on the other line. This is my second call with Speaker Pelosi, questioning the information I'd given to Vice President Pence about when we can get back into chambers. I assured her that information was correct. I could get them back into chambers by 7 p.m., and the call ended. That was call number 2. Call number 3 was 6:25 p.m. I was over at the Senate from the secure location, from where the Senate had been sequestered, and on a cell phone using Robert Karam's cell phone, they dialed leadership, who was over off-site at a secure location, and I briefed all of the leadership of the plans to get them back into chambers. That would have been call number 3 with Speaker Pelosi.
So you didn't have one call, you didn't have 2 calls, you had 3 calls. So Speaker Pelosi's comments that she didn't speak to you are inaccurate.
That is correct, sir.
Let me shift gears and go back as it relates to the optics of bringing people up to Capitol Hill and running things up the chain of command, ultimately to the Speaker's office. Do you think Speaker Pelosi's office or Speaker Pelosi herself politicized Capitol security?
I have no idea on that, sir.
Okay. Any other clarifications you'd like to make as it relates to Speaker Pelosi's comments that you didn't speak to her?
I just, wish she had considered that, wish she had considered some of the stuff that I've faced and the efforts I went through to bring in the outside resources on that day before she called for my resignation.
I want to go back to your recollections in the transcribed interview of Mr. Irving. He said that on January 6th, the initial statement about the guard occurred on a phone call. You noted it's in his office, which is correct.
Can you repeat the question, sir? Just so I...
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mr. Irving said that on January 6th, the initial statement about the guard occurred on a phone call. You contend that you went into his office to discuss the guard.
On January 6th?
Yes.
No, sir. I was in the command center on January 6th when we became under attack at 12:53.
Okay.
I was there for several hours until I left at approximately 5 p.m. to go see the vice president and go check on the Capitol.
Thank you. On January 6th, Mr. Irving said that when you called and asked his permission to ask for the guard, he gave you permission. Is that correct?
That is false. I think if you look at his testimony, he says when I first called him, I want to, just for clarification, at 2 o'clock, because I think his testimony is before I was saying I might be needing the National Guard. That is absolutely not true. When I first called at 12:58, I absolutely said we need the Guard now. I think my response was, I think we're getting our asses handed to us. And so, no, it wasn't correct that he gave me approval on the first call.
So when comparing your transcribed interview with the January 6th committee and the transcribed interview of Mr. Irving, there seems to be some pretty big discrepancies in the timeline of events and how they happen. Can you explain the discrepancies?
Maybe there's problems with recollection. The one thing I'd say is when you think there's discrepancies, realize that Congress did try and change the law to correct those discrepancies in the sense of they changed the law, giving the chief the authority now. So obviously they agree with my position.
Well, I thank you for being here, Mr. Sun. And we really are working as chair of the full committee to depoliticize Capitol Police. I remain concerned that under the previous Congress, under the previous Speaker, Capitol Police was politicized, and we're working to depoliticize the security apparatus on Capitol Hill. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly oppose of this Republican's latest assault on the health and safety of our children. Every child deserves clean air to breathe. We in California believe this is our sacred duty. That is why our state has taken strong action to reduce vehicle pollution, preserve our environment, and protect our children. So I just have one question for our allies across, our colleagues across the aisle. Why? Why don't you want children to have cleaner air to breathe? Why don't you understand what this means to their health? Why do you not understand the connection between pollution and asthma and how unfair that is to children in our population? That's why more than 5 decades ago, this Congress acted to preserve California's authority to protect our children and has repeatedly reauthorized that since. Despite this precedent, this bill would restrict the ability of states like California to protect families from dangerous pollution. Now, it's important for people to understand that, as the gentlelady pointed out, this is at the discretion of the states. 17 states have decided that they would use such a waiver in order to protect the children and the air that they breathe. So why would you want to throw the American auto industry into disarray, diminishing leadership and electric vehicle future? You know, Mr. Speaker, as the gentlelady referenced, it's an economic decision that our industry makes. We have in this body, in the Democratic majority, come to the aid of the auto industry, not corporations, but the industry and the workers. And we want our auto industry to be preeminent in the world. California is a very big market for the auto industry. For 50 years, they have lived with this emissions standard, this waiver that enables that to happen. If you're making cars for California, it's easier then to make the same safe cars for the rest of the country because it's a big market in California. And 16 other states have followed suit, representing at least 40% of new auto purchases in our country, a big chunk of our auto industry economy. So again, what would be the reason that you would interfere into the free market of the auto industry, into the free breathing of our children of cleaner air? The only explanation could be that big oil opposes this legislation. They're so living in the past, they don't even realize it, that the future is upon us, and the future is for the children. With that, I urge a no on this rule and yield back the balance of my time.
Reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, for 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, just moments ago, the distinguished gentle lady from California made the statement and asked why Republicans don't want clean air and clean water. I reject that premise, because this administration would rather mine in the Congo, where they use child slave labor, zero environmental standards, and zero labor standards to get to these EV vehicles. This administration has stopped mining in the biggest copper nickel find in the world, which is in northeastern Minnesota. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and this administration has stopped it. So don't come here and ask me why my Republican colleagues and I have the stance we have. We are environmentalists and we want clean air and clean water. That's an excuse. We can mine in this country. We do not have to put memorandums of understanding with the Congo, who use child slave labor. And that's a fact. We can mine in northeastern Minnesota using union labor with the best environmental standards and the best labor standards in the world. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to allow it to happen, along with this administration. Don't stand on this House floor and say this about the Republican Party and my colleagues. We are environmentalists as well. We mine in the United States of America. We mine in northeastern Minnesota. We can show the world, because when we allow China to take the demands for critical minerals, that pollutant gets in the jet stream and affects us all, as the gentle lady from California says. We breathe that disgusting air that comes from the communist country of China. So let us mine here, Mr. Speaker. Allow this administration to let us mine here. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of this rule so we can consider H.R. 1435, the Preserving Choice in Vehicle Purchases Act. This week, we read about horrific cross-country road trip President Biden's Secretary of Energy faced as she tried to travel the country in her electric vehicle. At every stop, Secretary Granholm struggled to charge her government-paid EV. She had to send staffers in gas-powered vehicles ahead of her to stand in line at the EV charging station, going so far as to block families from charging their own vehicles on hot summer days. Her gas-powered vehicle from her staff had to go sit in front of a charging station, waiting for her to come so she could charge her vehicle to make a statement and let that family suffer, waiting for the charging station to be opened. Now, just imagine if Secretary Granholm tried driving across northern Minnesota in the middle of winter. 20 below, 37 below, 50 below. By the way, that cold in Minnesota, we still go to work and we still mine and we still weld in the coldest of temperatures. Can you imagine her trying to do that? I'm not even sure her EV would even start. My constituents do not have the luxury of having government-paid staffers to advance their road trips and access EV charging stations ahead of time. My constituents cannot afford to pay an extra $17,000 on average for electric vehicle, especially as Bidenomics destroys the pocketbooks of my constituents who have had to pay an average of $10,000 more a year. If Americans want to drive EVs? They can, but they shouldn't be forced to. It should be their choice. Today, nearly 95% of Americans drive an internal combustion engine vehicle powered by gasoline or some form of ethanol or biofuels. If liberal elitists from California want to drive electric vehicles, so be it. But my constituents, Mr. Chair, should not be forced to do the same. I believe in choice, not mandates by the federal government. And I urge my colleagues to join me supporting this rule and supporting H.R. 1435, because it is time that Congress steps up and protects our constituents from ridiculous mandates that affect our way of life. And I yield back.